Afra Jalabi was a luminous presence at our conference last April 9th, Nonviolence in the Islamic Traditions. And she still illuminates on our website with her full speech. Right? Somebody, we've got a witness. Okay. So please do, if you'd like, go to fnvw.org as the website, and it'll tell you how to get to her and the other speakers. Afra brought to the topic of nonviolence in Islam something that that many people don't necessarily, I guess I will actually say. So clearly coming from her heart and her gut, as well as her fantastic intellect about this whole situation. The whole, you know, on April 9th, the Arab Spring, so-called, which I call the Revolutionary People's Freedom Movements in South Asia and North Africa were blooming. Mubarak had been toppled about 2 or 3 weeks before our conference, so it was all very timely. It was Afra who, simply in the passion of your emails and your speaking at the conference and your staying in contact with us since then, who really got me to get it. It's like, okay, Syria, people are rising up against really one of the most repressive dictators and regimes, since it has gone from the father to the son and gotten worse. And people are rising up month after month after month and becoming more and more committed to nonviolence as the way that it's going to work, as possibly the only way they're going to be able to prevail. And so suddenly I got it. You know, it's like, wow, this is, all of us who are committed to nonviolence here in this country and in the world need to lift up this situation, not only because thousands of people have been apprehended and hundreds for certain, maybe thousands killed, that for sure and for real, and because we need to know that this is where the voice of nonviolence is most loudly and most with the most intricacy and subtlety being developed right now. This is where we need to look and see, okay, what can this mean for the world that so deeply needs nonviolence? So when Afra emailed me on Tuesday and said, hey, maybe I'll come this weekend. And I said, great, let us know. And so Wednesday she said, hey, yeah, I'd like to. And so we you know, just acted quickly, and many, many people helped us to bring her here.
Thank you all for being here despite the short notice. I wasn't sure I would be in Montreal given the volatile situation in Syria and some of the traveling some of us are doing. And I was just explaining to Barbara how at this very moment I'm actually in Vancouver, because at this very moment another conference is happening in Vancouver, but I pre-recorded my lecture. He said you're watching that now. And I think that is the amazing thing about our time, that one of the strongest or most potent tools of these young revolutions is the use of technology. And when you see the way the youth movement has been communicating and networking and integrating tons of information and integrating that to mobilize the movement, you realize that there is no way of backing off and backing up. And while I'm seeing the Syrian youth using technology in incredible ways and using Twitter, Facebook, and even the way they're going around proxy programs in Syria. When I haven't been able to be back in the last few years because I became on the wanted list. But before that, when I would go and see the way they were using proxy programs because there were so many blocked sites, I would just see your average Syrians, especially the youth, being so proficient at computers that I would say that if there's freedom and democracy, this would become one of the, like a Silicon Valley in the Middle East. And then in the meantime, we recently heard that President Bashar al-Assad brought back the old guard of his father, who are now in their late 70s and 80s, to crush this revolution. And to think of that as to me, is a symbolism of the contrast and the incompatibility of two mindsets and two paradigms. Here you have a young revolution that is motivated by values of democracy and freedom and equality and pluralism, and then you have this, and relying on the youth, even as young as 10 and 12, and a lot of, I mean, the first imprisoned in Syria were 8-year-old children, fourth graders, who dared to write anti-regime slogans on their school walls. And that was the first spark of the revolution, when they were taken and brutally tortured. And so the families of, and the relatives and the friends of these people came out, and they were demanding their release. And when they were released, the families discovered they were brutally tortured. So you have a youth movement, and then you have a regime that's relying on older and older people to get back to the victories of their past glory, and they're not realizing that their time is up and that it's a different world, and not only in terms of the values that have become articulate in our age, but also the tools of the age have changed. And that's why the only way they are dealing with this uprising and revolution in Syria is through the power of force, sheer, brutal force. And you basically have the power of the word and reason in the face of a tank. Literally, this is what's happening. Nonviolence in Syria has been perhaps somewhat of a marginal movement. My uncle was one of the leading figures, Jawdat Saeed. He wrote one of his first books on radical nonviolence. I call it radical nonviolence in the sense that you have a lot of peace movements that believe in using peaceful means, but not necessarily declining from self-defense. So when I talk about nonviolence, I'm using it in the context of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, the idea of using compassion and the awakening, and also ability to see the humanity of the other side and to bridge the gaps that separate human beings. And so when my uncle wrote his first book on nonviolence, he wrote it from a Muslim perspective because he wanted to relate to his audience, to his Muslim audience, that nonviolence was part and parcel of their culture, of their history. And he used the Quranic scripture and early Islamic history of the way the Prophet Muhammad established his city-state nonviolently, and arriving at that through collective contracts with the people, and by which the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth, and as a continuation of the message of Jesus. And here you see that there's no difference between Christianity and Islam, except through the historical process that continued in the context of the Islamic message. Because throughout the time of Muhammad in Mecca, they were severely persecuted. But they did not resist. They did not raise their hands to defend even themselves. So sometimes Muslims who are not aware of these subtleties or differences in the Meccan period and the Medina period, where Islam became a city-state and a centralized political force, they sometimes say Islam is a religion of peace except in cases of self-defense. But when you read the actual scripture and you follow the behavior of the Prophet Muhammad, you realize that in fact, no, in most contexts, self-defense is not allowed in the Quran. And that when violence is allowed under a legitimate rule of law and collective consent, it is morally constrained, and it is actually used as a last resort to save people, to spare blood and not to spill blood. For there are clear verses in the Quran that say, if you fight in the cause of worldly goods and power, your destination is in hell. The idea is that if it is used as a last resort. So I wanted to clarify that because some people take many verses, especially coming to the United States. I know you hear a lot about Islam and violence, that they take a lot of verses from the Quran out of context and say that the Quran actually sanctions and commands violence. And many times these verses are taken out of context, out of the severe conditions placed on them, and many times the end of the verse is not even included, which is, and if you forgive, it is better. Many times I've seen verses cut up. So that's why I'm explaining the context, because yes, there are some violent verses in the Quran, but they are under severe conditions. And my uncle is good friends with the Dalai Lama, and even the Dalai Lama says that, even from his radical Buddhist nonviolence, he says sometimes there are situations like Rwanda or other places where people are morally obliged to use every means possible, but at some point it might be used as a last resort. I mean, that's debatable, but the only context the Quran allows violence is under these severe conditions and as a last resort. But my uncle actually says that at the same time we have, now because I was speaking earlier of technology, that violence as a means of solving problems, even if it did in some way in other generations and other historical contexts, it has become obsolete in our time. And that he says that war is a dead institution. Because my uncle says that with the drop of the nuclear bomb, peace exploded, because we have reached the dead end of the use of violence to achieving anything. Because when we have arrived at that level, the very notion of war, which revolves around concept of victory, became obsolete, because violence now means self-annihilation. And it's destruction not of the other, but destruction of self. And that is the very moral nature of nonviolence, which is that when I destroy you, I destroy my humanity. But the amazing thing about modern technology is that we are seeing that very moral argument being technically translated in the way technology has made it clear to us that destroying you means destroying myself. Therefore, we are living in an age where war has become obsolete. And this is the main argument of my uncle's recent writings and for the past 2 decades, that war has died as an institution. And that even if it served some form of a means to power, it doesn't even do that. If it used to raise nations and destroy nations, at this moment it only destroys. And so we're only paying homage to a dead institution. There's an image of Solomon in the Quran where he's standing, leaning on a cane, and it's kind of a mythological, symbolic image, fairly powerful, because he used forces of nature. If you remember the story, Solomon had the use of the jinns and invisible forces. And so in the story, the jinn discover after, it says, creatures of the earth start eating at the cane and Solomon collapses. And they discover he has been dead for a long time. and the invisible forces say, only if we knew that he had been dead for this long, we would not have toiled in suffering and wretchedness for this long. and so I love that image, because I feel that is the image of us still believing in the power of violence in an age where it no longer serves a purpose. And so those of us who are awakening to the new possibilities of our age have the moral obligation and the political responsibility to support these movements that are helping in shifting that paradigm, not just locally. What is at stake here is a global thing. This is what's happening in Syria is not a Middle Eastern local conflict. What is happening in Syria is part of the moral shift of our global paradigm, from that institution of violence to the power of moral persuasion and to the power of compassion. And I'm giving you some of the ideas that I grew up with and that my uncle has been writing about since I edit some of his work and translate for him. There has been people who have been directly connected to him and to other figures in Syria who have been part of this movement for the last 12 years, particularly the suburb of Daraya around Damascus. And for the last 12 years, this youth movement has been trying to exercise their utmost with the least space of public action. So people like Yahya Sharbaji, one of the leading figures of that movement, a young man in his 30s, for example, in the year 2001 and 2, organized a public action with the help of his friends to clean up their neighborhood. And many of them were either medical students or young doctors and engineers, went to the streets and cleaned up their neighborhood, which really inspired the community to see these highly educated people and young activists do this for their neighborhood. They also raised consciousness campaigns against smoking, against bribes, and they created a local library. And the group was arrested and were sentenced from sentences ranging from 4 months to 4 years. Yahya Sharbaji was sentenced to 4 years, and he served 2.5 years of them in prison, and there was some kind of pardon later and some procedures that I won't get into now, and he was released after 2.5 years. And they were arrested not because they cleaned up the neighborhood, but because under martial law, something you take for granted in the United States, the right to assembly is not allowed in Syria. So what happened is that this young group were meeting and were able to manifest some sort of a public action and a public campaign. And that meant they were becoming a group. And that was a threat to the regime. That now you're cleaning up a neighborhood. What are you going to clean up next? So with this kind of commitment to using the non-existence actually of a margin of movement and action and thinking, they still managed to create some sort of movement through their consciousness, through their commitment to nonviolence. And there are other groups also around Daraa and in that area that also have been trying to do this sort of networking and consciousness raising. And the regime was really severely curtailing their movement. I remember when I was there 3 years ago, the amount and the length the regime went to prevent traveling between different cities, especially around sometimes my uncle's lectures. They would put checkpoints to prevent some of the young to come. And sometimes we would clearly have a security agent come to the lecture. I mean, conspicuously among us. And sometimes I was wondering, like, so what are we going to do? And then my cousin said, oh, he's very welcome. Maybe he might get enlightened and, you know, like, if he understands what we're talking about, this is very good, you know. And sometimes they would be too, oh, even better. So they were always open to them, but you would see that the surveillance and the incredible repression. And of course, you know, they would take people who would come regularly to interrogations and sometimes really difficult processes of like, where are you going? And so that unless you were really, really committed, it was made extremely hard to engage in any sort of public or intellectual activity, unless it was allowed and legitimated by the regime itself. Which is why there's certain religious movements in the country that were very much encouraged because they were very pro-regime and they just focused on specific religious practices as long as they did not say anything critical or controversial.
Sounds familiar.
And that's why the Syrian revolution and what's happening in the Arab world is not just a local phenomenon, it's not a regional issue, it's actually a global phenomenon. It's the rise of the people with the reliance on the power of truth and justice to stand for what we believe is right without causing harm. The Daraya group, with the rise of the Arab Spring, was very much inspired, as well as so many other groups in Syria. And although many of us were thinking that not much can happen in Syria, given the iron grip of the regime, to our shock and surprise, the Syrian people rose against this regime. And we became increasingly aware that the Syrian youth movement was willing to sacrifice tremendously to overthrow the regime. Unlike the situations in Tunisia and Egypt, that although people were also very much committed, we found ourselves in a situation that was similar to Libya in terms of the practices of the regime, and yet a Syrian public that was committed to keeping it like Tunisia and Egypt. And the country pretty much unanimously said, we do not want military intervention, and we do not want to resort to arms. Because if we do that, we will end up with another dictatorship, because whoever uses arms will end up winning through the power of arms. We may change faces, but we will not change the situation. And because the president had inherited the country as if it was private property, handed down to him from the father had gotten the country through a military coup. And for 41 years, the Syrians lived under a military dictatorship that practiced some of the most brutal forms of repression, including the destruction of an entire town in 1982, when branches of the Islamic militant youth took to arms and rebelled against the regime. But the regime collectively punished the entire city, not just the youth movement that broke off from these Islamic movements. And not all the Islamic organizations at the time were sanctioning the use of violence. It was more the militant youth movement that just felt that we could do something. Maybe we could do an armed coup d'etat. And it was limited, but the society at large was collectively punished. And the city of Hama, where the insurrection took place, was completely destroyed within a week, in the month of February in 1982. People, in the modest numbers, put the death rate of that week at 10,000. The regime guards, people who, including the brother of the president, of the former president, the father of Assad, bragged to Thomas Friedman that actually they killed 38,000 in 1 week, instead of being ashamed and trying to reduce the number. So we still have, we have these kind of varying numbers. 70,000 people disappeared in the 80s in Syria. Wow. And tens of people perished in prisons. We have not counted our dead yet, just from the father's period, let alone from the son's last 6 months of a brutal crackdown. And we were not able also to mourn the death of the 80s because of the incredible repression. And that's why the word martyr in Arabic has taken on a significant symbolism in the culture, because at that time they couldn't even call them martyrs. But now that the people, and it's to the offense of the regime, are calling their fallen heroes martyrs, because it's a way of stressing that witness aspect. Because in Arabic also, as it is in Latin, the word shaheed means witness. And in the Quran, it's never actually used in the context of fighting. It's more used in the context of being a witness to truth, just like the Christian tradition. And this is where I think the challenge lies, because the idea of martyr or witness is the idea of standing to truth and willing to die and willing not to commit wrong in the face of death and brutal torture and killings. And that's why the Syrian regime is frantically keeping the media off. Because once international media is inside Syria and are witness, the world is witness to what's taking place in Syria, the world will be shocked of what is taking place. Because you have a revolution that is pretty much, in general, committed to a nonviolent paradigm with some radically nonviolent core groups, and you have a brutal regime I don't know how many of you have heard the story of our friend Ghiath Matar, the young Syrian activist who joined the revolution only 6 months ago, or maybe 7 months ago. And he became one of the leading figures because of his charisma and his charm and his beauty inside out. And he was able to relate the message to many people in the youth movement. And he was working with Yahya Sharbaji and others in creating proactive steps in awakening the humanity of the security people and the soldiers and even the thugs, which are referred to in Syria as Shabiha. And their commitment was that if we give water and roses and sweets and love letters, that we're trying to bridge that gap. And Yahya always stressed to the people of Daraya and other coordinating committees in Syria that by doing this, we're not just awakening the humanity of the other side, but we're also committing to our humanity in the face of this brutality and ugliness.